So I'm very pleased to welcome you all guys here tonight for this lecture by Lindsay Bremner. This is part of a lecture series that we're running for the Design for BioCities contest, which you can find more info about on the IAAC website. But before I hand it over to Lindsay, I wanted to briefly give her an introduction. I actually became aware of Lindsay's work because she previously held the position as Professor of Architecture and Chair in the Tyler School of Art at Temple University in Philadelphia from 2006 to 2011, which is actually where I went to architecture school. Lindsay is a research architect and educator at the University of Westminster in London, where she is Director of Research in the School of Architecture and Cities. She recently held a European Research Council grant from 2016 to 2021 for the project titled Monsoon, Assemblages, a project exploring 3 Bay of Bengal cities, thinking about the ways in which monsoonal assemblages are being disrupted and transformed by globalization and climate change. Lindsay holds a B.Arch from the University of Cape Town and an M.Arch and Doctor of Science in Architecture from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And to just tell you a little bit about the talk tonight, Lindsay will think through what it means to reframe spatial research around the monsoon, a weather system that envelopes the globe, approaching cities as monsoon assemblages or weather worlds. It will thus challenge ways of thinking of cities and climate or society and nature as separate entities stacked up against one another, and instead explore the multiple ways which they are entangled and co-produced. So without further ado, Lindsay, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. And I'll just hopefully successfully share my screen. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you're going to enjoy the lecture. Right, share screen. Does that work? That good?
Yes, looks
great. Can you all see it? Great. Okay. This presentation arises out of the work of Monsoon Assemblages, as has been mentioned, which was a research project funded by the European Research Council from 2016 to 2021. And just to repeat a little bit of what was said in the introduction, what I'm going to do this evening is to think through what it means to reimagine cities as weather worlds, beginning with the monsoon, the globe. It will challenge ways of thinking cities and climate, society and planet as separate entities, instead exploring the multiple ways they are entangled and co-produced. To begin, I go back to when I first started understanding cities as part of the Earth's complex system. It was in Johannesburg, the city I lived and worked in for many years, which is located where it is because it's where an underground seam of gold reaches the surface. And Johannesburg is actually at the top of that sort of yellow banana-shaped east-west running line at the top of the central map. This is a 56-kilometer long ridge running east to west, which is not only where the gold, which was deposited over millennia in underground seams by alluvial processes, and then shot to the surface when a meteorite landed millions of years ago, but this ridge is also the watershed between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, which is what the diagrams on the left try to show. It is also, as the map on the right shows, a very convenient buffer zone between the black and the white parts of the city, which were laid out during apartheid years. Johannesburg, in other words, registers not only the time of human stories founded on the extraction of gold, but also the deep time of geology, of catastrophic events, and the ongoing cyclical time of meteorological hydrological flows. In 2005, I was invited to participate in the Rotterdam Architecture Biennale, whose theme that year was Mare Nostrum, our sea. I presented some research on Durban, a city on the eastern shore of Southern Africa, inaugurating a new research focus on the Indian Ocean that I called Folded Ocean. Just to explain this name a little, if one folds a map of the Indian Ocean down its center, almost in line with the Maldives archipelago, Very strangely, the two shores map onto one another almost precisely, creating this extraordinary symmetrical idea of the ocean, which of course is completely unreal. It's a complete myth that I told myself, but this enabled me to reimagine cities as part of oceanic territories and the ocean as an agent of human settlement. It produced what I called a bioptic chart of the ocean, which tracked how the ocean was folded into human history in and around its shores. Monsoon assemblages developed out of Folded Ocean, for it was during the Folded Ocean project that I met the monsoon, so to speak. I decided to follow this powerful weather system into 3 South and Southeast Asian cities in 3 different countries: Chennai in India, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Yangon in Myanmar, which were united and differentiated by their location around the Bay of Bengal. The project asked, what might it mean to reframe urban research around the monsoon and to think of cities as monsoonal assemblages? So what is the monsoon? The monsoon is a weather system that stretches around the globe in the tropics. And in this map, the monsoon covers the areas which are in the sort of darker tealy green color. And you will notice a wavy line, red line to the north of the equator and a blue wavy line south of the equator. And this really is what's called the intertropical zone and marks how the sort of tropical thermal equator moves north and south of the geographical equator seasonally over the course of the year. In the Indian Ocean, what this does is, as the sun moves in the northern hemisphere northwards, it heats up the Tibetan plateau, and the colder air over the ocean is pulled towards the Indian subcontinent. So the wind blows in from the southwest. In the northern winter, as snow falls on the Himalayas and the ocean retains its heat for longer, the winds reverse and they blow southwards from the northeast. This meant that the word monsoon itself comes from Monsoon in Arabic, meaning seasons. And it was these reversing prevailing winds that were originally used by sailors in the Arabian Sea to refer to the seasonal reversal of prevailing winds, which occurred at relatively fixed times of the year that made the earliest transoceanic trading systems in the world possible. Now, whereas the monsoon is known as a system of winds over the ocean, it is known as a period of intense rainfall over land, which brings life and renewal as well as death and destruction. The notion of assemblage comes from the French word agencement, which means the arrangement, layout, or fitting together of parts. The word was brought into contemporary theory by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Assemblages are not stable wholes because they are not a simple sum of their parts, but rather of parts and the interactions or liaisons between them. In an assemblage, each part maintains an energetic pulse slightly off that of their relations, making assemblages radically open-ended and emergent. In approaching cities as monsoon assemblages, 2 things followed for us. First of all, that they were lived, emergent associations between a range of heterogeneous entities, from desires and ideas to plans to politics to economics to infrastructure to technologies, etc. And that these diverse entities were held together not by design, but by a kind of thrown togetherness, and could be thrown together in different ways. And the second thing that emerged from this idea for us was that cities are not only human productions, but they are animated by the active agency of monsoonal and other non-human dynamics and forces. The monsoon, or weather in other words, was not a neutral or inert backdrop on which human lives were played out, but rather it actively contributed to and interfered with human affairs through unique dynamic materials associations with them. I love this video. It's of a water hyacinth floating downstream and a boat struggling to cross in the opposite direction on a river in Bangladesh, which brings to life this idea of the monsoon not being an inert backdrop, but constantly interfering with human agency and human intent. This brings urban studies into conversation with Elizabeth Gross's call to think through rather than about the earth, and to afford political power to the elemental forcefulness of the earth itself. Monsoon assemblages was framed by this approach to urban studies. It was an experiment in thinking cities through the elements of the monsoon and their forcefulness. It was an attempt to mobilize the monsoon to think with, to develop new methods of research with, to generate new concepts with, and to make new drawings with. In this way, it challenged ways of thinking cities and climate, or society and nature, or human and planetary history as separate entities, and instead attended to the multiple ways they were co-produced. But the monsoon is more than the annually recurring meteorological phenomena I described earlier. It is an atmospheric principle that unites deep ocean currents with the upper tropospheric strata of our planet and seeps into almost every aspect of life in the regions of the world it shapes: their politics, their economics, their food, their sex, their cultures, their religion, and their daily lives. These two images on the screen show the kind of everyday rituals. On the left is the everyday rituals of collecting water in areas that are drought stricken. And the image on the right is of before monsoon breaks, because it's a period of time associated with ill health, with wetness, with humidity, and with calamity. And so this special porridge is made in order to give fortitude to the body before the monsoon arrives. So there are foods and rituals associated with life in the monsoonal regions of the world. We live in a world where political geography and spatial planning have assumed permanent and easily observable divides between land, sea, and air. Land is understood as solid, stable, divisible, and the basis of human habitation. It can be parceled out and turned into profit. The sea is understood as liquid, mobile, indivisible, and hostile to human settlement, while air is understood as gaseous, mobile, invisible, but indispensable to human life. The monsoon cuts across these divisions. It inundates lived environments every year, connecting land with sea and sky. It is a spatial practice that reorganizes air, water, land, settlements, cities, buildings, and bodies through heat, wind, rain, inundation, flow, and flood. It unites science with politics, deep time with lived time, and policy with affect. Today, climate change is disrupting its cycles, and explosive economic is increasing the unpredictability of its ways. How can the spatial design and environmental humanities respond to these twin conditions of volatility and unpredictability? We thought, might thinking with and drawing on the agency of the monsoon as a resource for spatial theory, analysis, and design practice offer a way to do so. This was Monsoon Assemblage's endeavor. It required thinking across disciplines, elements, species, scales, and times. Learning to think like a climate and with the weather required drawing from many disciplines and practices, from science, from critical theory, from race theory and anthropology, from conversations and observations, from embodied experiences, from multi-species encounters, from maps and music. And drawing these diverse forms of knowledge into conversation with one another in order to understand complex situations and evolve new hybrid methodologies for engaging with them. Our thesis was that by tuning research to monsoonal logics, we would better know how to go about forging more resilient futures. We used two primary methods of research, cartography and ethnography, while being aware that both were tainted by the legacies of colonialism and the part they played in projects of empire around the world. But I just want to go into these two methods that we used, the first being cartography. On the one hand, we thought with the monsoon of science. We read a lot of scientific papers and used open source climate data and tools used by architects, Rhino, Grasshopper, and to a lesser extent, GIS and RealFlow, to research the monsoon by drawing it. We drew it as instruments. This is an extraordinary map, I think, of all the instruments of observation that the data came from, which we mapped in our maps of the monsoon. We mapped the monsoon as atmosphere. This is a drawing of the toxic cloud of smoke that was moved by two cyclones and the Earth's Coriolis force from North India down the eastern coast, right down to Chennai in 2018. So the monsoon as an atmospheric condition. We mapped the monsoon as hydrology. This is a drawing of rainfall over North India and Bangladesh in 2018. And we mapped the monsoon as geology. This is a section through Myanmar that shows 100 years of geological movement mapped against the kind of atmospheric movement that corresponds with it. And we tried to understand the relationships between these kinds of maps in order not to ground our sensibilities, but to unground them and to locate us within this uncertainty that was the monsoon. On the other hand, we approached the monsoon through its lived reality using ethnographic research methods. And here we had the enormous advantage of having an anthropologist in our team. We did a lot of walking. Here we are walking along one of the water supply lines in Myanmar. We did an enormous amount of talking. Here I am talking over a map of the rivers of Bangladesh with a dredging company. We also did a lot of eating. I discovered that one of the methods used by anthropologists for their research is to eat. And here we are eating a seasonal monsoonal a fish whose life cycle corresponds with the monsoon, also in Myanmar. We observed, here's a street where people are raising the alley above its surface in order to make sure that they escape monsoonal floods in downtown Yangon. We videoed a lot, we interviewed. And through these methods, we found out just how entangled human and non-human lives were with the monsoon in the places we were studying. Through these methods, we began to question Cartesian ideas about dimension. And this is the point I'm getting through to with this talk, is to really spend a little while talking about how the monsoon caused us to question Cartesian ideas about space, linear ideas about time, and human-centric ideas about agency. So first of all, to deal with dimension. The dimensions of the monsoon are volumetric. They cannot be understood in topographic terms. They have to be thought through the idea of volume. One version of volume, and the one that we architects usually use on the basis and that underpins all our representational tools, is that volume equals three-dimensionality. And this three-dimensionality is based on a Cartesian understanding of space. The monsoon caused us to question this. For its volumetricism is emergent and constantly changing, bringing together land, sea, and sky in situated places in ways that exceed the Cartesian grid and cannot be contained by it. The monsoon suggests that Cartesianism is only one way to conceive of dimension, and furthermore, that it embodies the violence of empire, which attempted to collapse volume into two-dimensional flatness in order to turn it into profit. Cartesianism imposed a version of dimensionality that sought to contain other, more topological, relational, or Lagrangian conceptions of dimension. The monsoon offers resistance to this and suggests an idea of dimension conceived in terms of what Jess Beer calls deep positionality, in which space is not registered as points in a gridded Cartesian space, but as places enveloped in life worlds of multiple dimension. This is an image of people collecting rainwater from a tanker in a suburb in Chennai. And as you look at this video, you kind of think, well, where do the dimensions of this everyday practice begin and end? And one realized that one cannot measure them through Cartesian ideas of space. For monsoonal dimensionality is an entanglement of scales and matters, of rhythms and times, of imaginaries and lived practices that intersect and interfere with one another in unpredictable ways. Okay, the second thing to speak about is the idea of time. The idea of regular, quantified, and linear time is a relatively modern invention associated with colonialism and largely as a political technology of the body, a way to organize and control labor and logistical flows around the planet. Interestingly enough, time zones were only laid out in 1883. And as this diagram shows, they're largely political constructs. They're hardly geographic ones. And universal time only came into existence in 1972, once financial flows had to circulate around the planet, and it was a way of organizing them. And this is obviously linked to a story of progress and development. However, the monsoon operates according to a different kind of temporality. It's nonlinear, it's cyclical and rhythmic. It recurs and recycles back on itself. These images are of an urban lake in Chennai, which, because of the intensity of monsoon rainfall occurring over a very short period of time during the year, its water levels fluctuate and they become quite empty and then quite full again, which has resulted in these very strange phenomena, like the building on the right, which is standing actually in a wetland, but the wetland is dry because this is dry season. So it has these strange pilotis and ground plane raised above the surface in anticipation of the recurring cycle of the monsoon to come. And these photographs of a brick field in Bangladesh show that brick fields can only operate for 50% of the year, because for the other half of the year, they're underwater. So monsoonal time. this is an interesting slide as well. In monsoonal time, the past is never past, but ever present. We drew this map to show how the current Prime Minister of India's corridors, which he's designing across the country, which he's laying out across the country, these industrial corridors largely correspond with the lines of the Great British Survey of India conducted in the 19th century. So here again, one gets the sense of the time, history never being past, but being ever present. So monsoonal time is both chronological, it moves on from moment to moment, but it's also circular. One moment follows the next, but time also cycles back on itself. In fact, the deep time of the planet's history, recurring planetary rhythms and flows, and the time of human history and everyday life mutually interfere with one another. This makes monsoonal time not linear and progressive, but uncertain and unpredictable. And it invites us to embrace the possibilities of living with uncertainty. It provides an uncertain ground from which to weave new forms of knowledge and new forms of life. I'm not going to go into these today because I think I would run out of time, but the other two really important things that we learned from this work is that agency is more than human. The monsoon reminded us that entities other than human beings have agency in the world and invited us to consider new intersections between human and natural histories in the shaping of place. And finally, we learned that all knowledge, in order to acquire the kinds of knowledge that we need to operate in these very uncertain, unpredictable futures, is that knowledge needs to become interdisciplinary and intersectoral. For the monsoon crosses disciplinary boundaries. And the question becomes how to bring these different forms of knowledge into conversation with one another in order to understand, work with, and adapt to the monsoon and climate more generally as it is changing. The monsoon radically upended what we once saw as stable disciplinary paradigms and became an opportunity to radically reimagine what architecture and urban the spatial disciplines more generally are as discourses and practices. So in conclusion, as the climate emergency and the concept of the Anthropocene continue to redefine disciplinary boundaries across the sciences and the humanities, they invite us to consider new spatial and temporal scales as frames of inquiry, new material agencies, and new intersections between human and natural histories. The monsoon enabled us to understand architecture and cities as not only cultural, economic, and social assemblages, but also as shaped by and deeply embedded within planetary systems and processes, which they are now profoundly altering, and thus to argue for renewed critical thought that brings together planetary politics with the design of the built environment. So that's all I really have to say today, but I thought I'd also put our two websites on the board, on the screen, our project website and our exhibition website, if anybody would like to look at those any further. And finally, about 10 minutes before this talk started, I was sent the first images of our new book, which is going to be published by ACTAR later this month. And I think ACTAR might be in the audience, but it is the first time I got a glimpse of our new book, which is called Monsoon and Methods, Monsoon as Method, and takes the ideas which I've briefly elaborated on today, much deeper and much further. So thanks very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was really excellent. Really for us architects, I think, who are trained to use particular tools, it's really refreshing, I think, to see your work breaking down those boundaries, especially in the way you express the kind of limitation in our ability to really put the monsoon in a so-called like bounded box. And I think it absolutely helps us think through the future of cities, which will have to be more resilient. I guess I don't see any questions in the chat quite yet, but I think that I welcome people to raise their hands and kind of ask themselves. But I would start with a question actually for you, which is that, you know, if you say that these kind of Cartesian rules don't apply to monsoons and the tools that we architects are used to using are very much within these kind of parameters, was it challenging to address how to begin to draw such a thing? I think, how do you approach that kind of question?
It is a question that kind of underlies all that we did actually, and I think the point is not to reject Cartesianism, because if you look at all the drawings I've showed you today, they're all based on Cartesian grids. Climate science itself is based on Cartesian grids. I mean, our knowledge system is so kind of Cartesian that it's very difficult, that one can't actually escape it. But our point was to bring that Cartesian conception of space into conversations with lived realities, with more narrative kind of depiction of space, and to actually start to construct, not to be limited by the Cartesianism of our drawings and our way of thinking, but to think about what else is accreted onto those Cartesian surfaces that we love to draw. What kind of narratives weave through them? What kind of winds blow through them and across them? What kind of water flows through them? And thereby to actually kind of start to open up our imagination and our imaginaries to something beyond what Cartesianism can depict.
Yes, absolutely. And from the beginning, was your team very kind of, did you work with a large group of researchers for this project, and were they all from very different backgrounds, or were there also a lot of architects? Kind of, what was the idea behind that?
I should have spoken about the team. Thanks for reminding me. We were actually a very small team. The project was led by myself, and we had an anthropologist, Beth Cullen, as part of the team, a landscape architect, Christina Geros, an architect, a former student of mine, John Cook, and 2 PhD students, one of whom was an architect and one of whom was a political scientist. So we were actually a pretty small team. However, we had many, many collaborators in the field. And we worked very closely with organizations in the 3 cities that we worked in, with individuals. But the actual work itself was produced by this quite small team, all based at the University of Westminster.
Yes, because it does seem like the way in which you approached it, you needed all those different kind of players to understand how to kind of deconstruct that idea.
Yes, and if I could say, I mean, this really was an experiment in interdisciplinary work for all of us. And we came up against the real difficulties of doing interdisciplinary work. It's not plain sailing at all, because even the language that we use, and we assume other disciplines, that words mean the same things to them, they actually don't. So the kind of difficulties of language, the difficulties of method, the difficulties of disciplinary adherence to disciplinary norms, all of those things were a constant kind of, we had to constantly work through them in order to produce this work.
Mm-hmm. And has it inspired kind of further research in this direction? I know that for a while you've been working with this idea of monsoon. I just came across from many years ago, I guess, a competition submission that you had done about a monsoon shelter. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm curious, kind of, how will you go next? Like, how will you continue with this research, I guess?
Thanks, Kiara. I mean, actually, I've got a new research grant which I'm not allowed to speak about yet because the funder hasn't announced it, but it will enable me to work further in Chennai with an activist organization, 2 historians and an anthropologist in Chennai to really take this work further, but in a much more grounded way. We'll be developing an eco-restoration plan for a creek in North Chennai. So working on the ground in ways that Monsoon assemblages actually couldn't do. So it really will be a participatory design process and really test some of these more theoretical ideas that we were working with in Monsoon assemblages.
Very nice. And in terms of like the kind of architectural output, do you see it kind of furthering into any kind of physical architectural interventions, or is it, because this next project that you're talking about kind of seems to me almost like has to do with landscape architecture as well, right? It's a kind of infrastructural plan in some way. So I'm wondering, does that ever include kind of shelters or built work as well?
Well, as an architect, I shouldn't be able to answer that much more positively, but I'm far less interested in the kind of discipline of architecture now than I am in the sort of in a more landscape and territorial idea of spatial design, actually. So I personally don't have any. And the other kind of difficulty with designing, making proposals for actual physical infrastructure in places that one doesn't live in is one can so often get it wrong. And people in those cities are far better equipped to design the kind of design infrastructure at an architectural scale than we are, quite frankly. So no,
Yes,
no architecture planned as yet.
Yes, it seems very familiar, right? This kind of architectural prompt of we're going to be designing something in Japan, or we're designing something in a very remote place, which you often aren't familiar with. So this ability to work with a team and have some kind of other experts in the field kind of helping you along the way.
And really to players be led by the people who live in those environments, you know, and respond to what their lead is something that we feel quite strongly about. You know, the developing world is riddled with expertise that comes in and actually messes things up. So we really don't want to fall into that trap.
Yes, obviously this seems like a very pressing issue as well, the need for non-experts and the need for storytelling and artists and all of this stuff, which I think will play a big role in kind of the next generation of designers as well.
I think so.
Yeah, super fascinating. Anyone else have any questions for Lindsay while we're here? I see some comments in the chat.
Some comments. I don't see any questions.
Yes, so I think we had a question about the recording. It will be available afterwards, so we'll share that with everyone.
And, you know, I think I'm going to, if I may, jump on him. I see one of my PhD students is in the audience, who he himself has been taking the work that we did in Monsoon assemblages into another funded research project where he's now a postdoc scholar. Anthony, would you be prepared to say anything about that?
Hi. Yeah, thanks. I like to come back to these things, and can everyone hear me? Is that right? I like to come back to these things and listen to Lindsay speaking about the project. Also, with a bit of distance, I've just been downstairs actually because I'm in Central St Martin's right now, and there's an exhibition of some work of Monsoon assemblages in the gallery a couple of floors below where I'm sitting, and it's also been really enjoyable to think about what I'm doing now, which is as Lindsay said, it's a project about architectural practice in the face of climate and biodiversity emergencies. What if, you know, the model of architecture that we're working with, which I think you through your Biocities competition, you're acknowledging that the model of architecture we're working with is untenable in the face of the problems we face. how do we rethink architecture? So I've gone from a very specific inquiry in the PhD in relation to the Monsoon, in relation to groundwater in Chennai, and now I'm thinking about these very big ideas, but thinking about how much of the way I conceive the relationship between architecture and climate from the work I did with Monsoon assemblages is always really enjoyable to come back to. So I guess that's, it seems odd for me to ask you a question, Lindsay, but that's kind of where I am.
Great. I see there is a question, Kaya,
Yes.
From Scott Patterson. I don't know if he would like to phrase that himself, or should we just read it?
Sure. I mean, as someone who works at the intersection of architecture, anthropology, cities, and futures, it's just noteworthy the juxtaposition of your drawing, the scale of the drawings, and then the ethnographic observations of how people are coping with things at such a large scale. So they tend to be product level, well, at least in the photos. And so I was just curious if you saw any examples, strategies that exist at that level that are opportunities, optimistic about, I mean, you said from the government level, there are infrastructure plans which are reinforcing certain colonial histories. Yet there's a provocation that monsoons, climate are operating at a volumetric scale, that those are ignoring, say. So just curious if you saw anything like that. I mean, an example in urban design would be tactical urbanism. So attempts to temporarily make change to persuade people that this is better than that, and then slowly policy updates itself and allows more of those kinds of things to happen. So just curious if the ethnographic research helped inform opportunities that would ultimately show up in the cartographic area.
Well, that's a great question about the whole question of scale, because you're quite right. I mean, we worked at such divergent scales. But if I could just answer your question, you know, because globalization has been so successful and the neoliberal model have been bought by the kind of government structures in the cities that we were working in, I don't hold out much hope for big infrastructural moves that are going to work with what we say, work with the monsoon, respond in a way that I mean, they're profit driven, you know, and they don't actually care. They climate proof things, or they attempt to, which means shutting the monsoon out, turning it into some kind of other. So I don't see actually anything positive emerging at that scale, I'm afraid. Where I do see positive things emerging is as at a tactical level, you know, in fishing, in kind of the way people are attempting to make their own lives more resilient. I think drawing on other forms of knowledge. I mean, for instance, in the project I'm going to be working in Chennai, we're going to be working with fishing communities whose lives have been completely devastated by a new port and thermal power stations in a large creek in North Chennai. But these fishing communities have a very, very powerful voice and have won numerous legal cases against the government in order to kind of restore their creek, drawing on their indigenous knowledge and practices to kind of map, for instance, to map kind of resource contamination and so on, through narrative storytelling and through GIS mapping and so on. So what I'm saying is that I think it's through kind of resistance to the dominant neoliberal kind of agenda that some kind of change is likely to emerge. And that's what I'm interested in supporting, actually. Sorry, it's not terribly clear answer, but I don't think it's going to happen at a big scale, no.
I mean, if I can follow up to your follow up. I mean, I appreciated that you said there's like no shortage of outsiders attempting to make solutions. And I think the examples I'm going to say, some of them are, well, there's two paths. There's some that are attempting to augment existing indigenous behaviors to know when to fish or where, combined with historical knowledge about where to do that. I'm thinking of things with salmon in Western Canada, for example, or drone technology is now so dirt cheap in terms of when and where to water your field to support migration of birds. So some of these things are getting relatively inexpensive as they hit certain scales. They hit that scale of these like patterns of your maps, but they are not, depending on the population, affordable. And because of the scale of the data that you can now harness, you can modify your behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like lots of really interesting examples around the world in fishing, farming, etc., where through extremely basic technology combined with essentially the data you are researching and collecting, right? Knowing like that photo that you had of the people who've created the tarp over themselves, that is then like they know when to do that a little bit more ahead of time than before, but something to improve that behavior, whatever that might be. So anyway, there's interesting pockets of examples that are going on in other regions that, that's why I asked my question. Because right now it seems still very kind of anecdotal and it's showing up in pockets. So I was curious if you had run across that.
Thanks a lot. Not really, but I think that's really useful. And I guess that's where I see the possibility of us contributing in a way, you know, through our non-expert expertise, because we're not cartographers, you know, we're actually misusing our architectural tools to do these kinds of drawings. But the question of scale, we have been criticized, like, why are your drawings all at such a large scale and why don't they become sort of closer to the ground? And the answer is because that's the scale that the data's at, you know. So ultimately, we are kind of reinforcing the kind of politics of data in a way through the kind of maps that we've done so far. But we are hoping that in this next project to be able to map at a very different scale that is more kind of in touch with the scale of the tactics that people are using. Yeah.
Could I do what I said I wasn't going to do and ask a question? Actually, it was going to be about the maps. Just having been downstairs, and for everyone who's not here, the exhibition is called Planetary, assemblages, and it's largely the kind of information at the scale of the planetary, or at least at the continental. And I was wondering what for you, Lindsay, maybe less so in relation to the project that's finished, but more in relation to what you're talking about doing next in Chennai, what you think it brings to you to have that planetary scale and then go right into the scale of a community.
You know, I think Anthony, I think what it enables us to understand is that scales are not clustered inside one another. You know what I mean? In fact, kind of what happens in Enor Creek in Chennai might actually be determined by what's happening at the other side of the Pacific. You know, that there's that sense that, you know, scale is not neat clusters, which is an assemblage idea, you know. And I think that's what's been the benefit of trying to understand kind of weather systems at a planetary scale, is to bring that sensibility to the kind of very local scale. And drawing on indigenous knowledge, I don't like that term, but drawing on the knowledge of the people, for instance, who use the ocean every day, okay, and understand what a particular wave means and where it's come from and why it's like that, you start to get a sense of this kind of relational notion of dimension and scale, actually. But it helped us to draw the maps at that scale. I don't regret doing that at all, because it's been a very useful framing, I think, of future work.
And I have a question about the exhibition that's happening now, Anthony, at, you said it's UC, what?
University of the Arts at Central St.
University of
Martin's.
Arts, okay. And it's Planetary Assemblages, you said, is the name of the exhibition, okay.
It's an exhibition in the university's gallery. It's called the Lethaby Gallery at King's Cross. It's very close to King's Cross Station. And it's the combination of Monsoon assemblages work and the work of another funded project called the Manifest Data Lab at Central St. Martin's, which was led by someone called Tom Corby. And what they did was they modeled, it's largely a digital modeling project, and they modeled CO2 emissions. So they're models of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. It's an extraordinary project. It comprises animations and global models, but really thinking at the scale of the globe, and modeling carbon emissions. And they've worked closely with the British Antarctic Survey for a lot of their data, and use very similar data to our data as well. Yeah, so if anyone's in London, it's worth paying a visit to that exhibition.
Absolutely. And just checking if we have, I don't think we have any more questions.
I don't think so, no.
But it was really wonderful to have you, Lindsay, and for everyone who kind of joined in just for a bit to ask questions and have a dialogue. It was wonderful. And I hope that, yes, you'll join us again at some point at IAAC, and you're always welcome to visit the school and see what we're up to there as well.
Thank you so much, Kia, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's been really great, and all the best with your competition.
Thanks. Thank you for sharing also the images of the book that you just got as well. It was super exciting to kind of celebrate that with you a little bit. All right. Thank you so much.
Online, so if anybody's interested in that, I'll let you know where it is. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.